Greetings, dear listeners. Sam was in Italy the other week, where he sat down with Rome-based political theorist Giovanni Orsina to talk about European populism. The conversation starts with Giorgia Meloni and ends up with a deeper discussion about the sweep of the 20th century and how the revolution of the 1960s is only now being challenged by today's counter-revolutionaries who demand a return to politics. Even with Orban gone, Orsina's vision is likely to hold. After all, he was hardly defeated by technocrats. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
So I'm really excited to, I've been kicking around Rome teaching the last week and also just kind of paying attention to the climate here. I'm really excited to have a conversation with, I think, one of the smartest intellectuals around in Rome and I think in Europe in general, Giovanni Orsina, who is excellent political theorist. And we'll get into a new book that he has coming out in a month or so. But first, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your sense about the current situation. So as of the recording of this, we've been at war and we've seen all sorts of erratic behavior, both by the US and by Iran, a lot of inconsistency. What do you feel like the current European situation is? How are people calibrating to it?
Yeah. All right. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to have this conversation. So what is the climate in Europe? Well, one of the great issues that is very strongly felt here in Europe is irrelevance, I think. And this has been growing a lot in the last, for some reason in the last 12 months and something more. I mean, since January 2025 has been growing a lot. And there is also a lot of talking about we should prepare, and at the same time, I wouldn't say that nothing is being done because I think quite a lot is being done, but it remains quite insufficient. And so the feeling of irrelevance remains quite strong. Certainly with this Iranian war, the thing has grown even more. Europe remains divided. There were different reactions. As we know, Spain reacted very badly. Germany had a different reaction, Italy too. As a matter of fact, this is all on the rhetorical plan because in practice, all European countries more or less reacted in the same way. So in the real world, the behavior was very convergent. There is today a kind of consultation between France, Italy, Germany, and the UK, which seems to be working quite well. But again, main feeling is let's wait and see. This is bad. We are afraid, but we feel quite impotent. We do not know what to do with that.
Do you feel like there's in terms of the sense of irrelevance, is that shared among countries that have traditional liberal parties in power and those that have new populists? So, I mean, Italy has something like a populist government now of some kind, and one that at least inconsistently seems allied with Trump in certain ways, though maybe you can talk about this a little bit. Does it feel like there's irrelevance no matter which side of that spectrum you're on? Or does it feel like the ones who are kind of allied with this new populist surge in America actually have more relevance than the other parties?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, the general feeling is also connected to Europe as an entity, that is to say the European Union. And again, I mean, one of the great problems of Europe, it is that it is in between the world of nation states and the world of the European Union. And this part, of course, part of the problem. So the feeling of irrelevance is general. Certainly it is very strong in Italy too. So there is a feeling that Meloni is doing a good job in keeping a dialogue open with the United States, but at the same time, there is also a feeling that there is not so much that she can do, and that bottom line, the current U.S. administration is not controllable and not controlled, not even by its friends. So it is a kind of damage reduction, I think, and this is one of the reasons why Meloni is appreciated. But it is more damage reduction than actually being able to profit from, also because a lot of the public opinion and the media is saying, quite a lot about the negative effects of the war on Italy and the Italian economy. And generally speaking, I wouldn't say this war is particularly popular among Italians.
Well, it may well have real consequence. I mean, if oil production is actually cut off from the Middle East in key places, suddenly you do have just instant negative effects here.
Of course, and Italy is very much dependent on oil and gas. Already energy is very expensive in Italy, and this is, of course, curbing the potential of this country to compete. And so anything that will add to this, is perceived as, of course, negative. So Italy is particularly vulnerable as an export-led economy with a very serious structural energy problem. Italy is particularly vulnerable. And of course, we are in the Mediterranean. The Gulf is in between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. So it's perceived as something that is happening, I wouldn't say in, Italy's courtyard, but not so far away from Italy's courtyard.
I mean, it's funny, even as I was preparing to travel here, Aspen's legal risk office was sending sort of very soft kinds of warnings, but said, you should be a little bit more attentive to the risk of terrorism. And I think they probably feel that in DC too. I mean, I think they're attentive to the possibility of there being tangible violent blowback, but they were also more aware of the possible European security landscape changing as well. So
absolutely. I mean, this is, I mean, again, if we look not at Europe, but at Italy is a country that is, does not feel like participating in the world's events. There is a very strong feeling here that we would like to be left alone. We feel vulnerable. This is also demographically an old country. And so this idea that, why should we don't want to look for trouble. We just want to be left alone. And so, of course, this is, you see this also when you ask Italians whether they are ready to defend Ukraine. It's, the numbers are much lower than even in other European countries. And so, of course, the idea that you are, we can become targets of some form of terrorism, and Italy didn't have Islamic terrorism, unlike Germany, unlike France, like Spain. So we felt somehow sheltered from all this. Of course, this is a wrong feeling, but this is just to say what is the general feeling of public opinion here.
When you think about Meloni, though, what are the parts of the government that do seem like they were trying to shift the background status quo? How pro or anti-European is she? What are other parts that you feel like, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about the history of populism in a second, but when you think about features that do seem genuinely populist in her approach, what are the key things that she's wanting to reform or relate to?
Truth is that she's not that much of a populist. We are speaking far more of a kind of traditional right-wing politician, and she comes from a tradition that was not populist. Then, of course, in the populist decade, 2013, 2022, she became more populist, or she took on some forms of populist rhetoric. But she's not that populist.
So it's not like Marine Le Pen or something. Like, it doesn't have this.
No, you see, Meloni comes from a governing tradition. And she comes, I mean, when she entered politics in the early 1990s, her party was a party that was in government in 1994, then again in 2001. So she has been governing. This party has been giving, mayors or presidents of regions. So that was a tradition. They came from a post-fascist culture that they couldn't use. So somehow that was a kind of empty space ideologically. But that was a very pragmatic governing tradition. And that's one of the reasons why, coming from this tradition, then she put on this tradition a number of populist, let's say, flags in the populist moment, but they were more flags than other things.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so you've studied populism for 15 years or something, especially Italian populism, but now you're watching this kind of broad current of things that have been happening. As you said, I mean, even since January 2025, there are all kinds of things that seem to have shifted. So maybe, I think our audience understands a lot of what has happened in broad terms, but I think probably don't understand the specifics in Italy at all. So maybe we start there. Tell me a little bit about, when do you think you first saw the rise of populism in Italy? And then how do you think that current worked? And then we'll come back to the more recent things as well.
Well, there is a let's say, deep current of populism in Italy. Italy is a country that has always had a very strong political side and a very strong state. And this is essentially because it used to be a backward country, and the state and politics were perceived as instruments of modernization. And this has led to the creation of a rather strong anti-political sentiment. For instance, there was a proto-populist party in 1945 to 1948 called the Movement of the Common Man, Uomo Qualunque. That was rather interesting because it was a form of individualistic proto-populism. So it was a kind of liberal populism, and which, the idea was to defend the common person, not to defend a collective identity. But certainly then there was, I think, the origin of it all is in the 1970s. As it is, I think, not only in Italy, but worldwide, or at least in advanced democracies, with the idea that politics is no longer an instrument to change the world for the better. It's become a problem. And there you see in Italy, 1970s, 1980s, is also connected to terrorism. Also, terrorism was as a consequence of a crisis of the political dimension. And you see there mounting this idea that the Italian civil society is much better than Italian politics, and that the people, the Italians, are better than politicians. And there was a rather strong mounting wave that culminated in the early 1990s. And this is the real difference from any other country. So there were countries that survived the end of the Cold War without major transformations. And then there were countries which had major institutional transitions. Italy is in between, as always, peculiar place. Didn't have an institutional earthquake, but didn't have continuity either. It had a kind of political earthquake. And in 1992, 1993, a judicial wave swept all traditional political parties, opening up a space that was very good for anti-politics and populism, meaning that, people are good and we need to rebuild the system on people and not on professional politicians.
Well, yeah, I want to get to this term of anti-politics much more deeply in a minute. So, but first, so when you think about the fact that you had a large populist wave in the 1990s, that does seem like a genuine dissimilarity in lots of places. So talk through what was it that precipitated the possibility for Berlusconi to rise to power in the first instance?
Well, that was the opening up of a major opportunity because in 1992, 1993, there was a kind of perfect storm connected with a number of mafia killings, very important, a major financial crisis, essentially crisis of the currency, was then the lira before the euro, of course, and then there was this huge wave of judicial scandals. And all this created a very strong popular public opinion wave, very strongly also that media contributed to that a lot, also in a kind of alliance with the judges. The judges had an immediate possibility to be heard by, and their thought and their actions to be vehiculated through the media. So this created these incredible moments, and in that moment, all the traditional governing parties in Italy were destroyed. Essentially.
How did that happen?
Mostly through judicial investigations. They started being investigated by the prosecutors, but in that moment, being investigated by prosecutor essentially amounted to a political death.
Yeah.
So even though
already an indictment.
it was enough. It was enough. It's called avviso di garanzia. It's essentially the document you receive if the prosecutor is starting to prosecute you. In that moment, 4 people, they were guilty, and so they started to they had to resign, and political parties just melted. It was incredible, because they still had the strength. They could have resisted. They still had the instruments. They had a majority in parliament, but the wave of public opinion was so incredibly strong.
What were the crimes that they were accused of?
Essentially, mostly it was illicit financing of political parties, which, by the way, is a minor thing.
Yeah.
In other cases, there were also corruption, which is, of course, a stronger indictment.
Yeah.
But mostly it was illegal financing of political. It was a Cold War fact. The illegal financing of parties was connected to the political system that was blocked by the Cold War. So essentially, what we had was a kind of post-war transitional justice. But instead of being managed by politics, this was managed by the judges. And politics was only kind of a victim of this transition. So essentially, in 1992, these political parties, the governing parties, still got more than 50% of the vote. End of 1993, all these parties had essentially melted down. They didn't exist anymore. And so those 50% of voters, they didn't have anyone to vote for. And it started to become very clear that the party that would benefit from all this were the post-communists. So, and that was a famous Berlusconi sentence, in Italy is a country where the Berlin Wall had fallen on the heads of the winners of the Cold War, not of the losers. And that's the moment when Berlusconi perceived that all those Italians who had supported the judges now were becoming unhappy because the fruits of the judges' work would be reaped by the post-communists. And these people were people of center-right, anti-communist, some of them even center-left, but anti-communists. And they didn't want the post-communists to win. And Berlusconi understood that there was the possibility, and he entered the fray in a moment in which politics was empty. These political parties were very heavy. They had money, they had they were on the territory, they had lots of places, of sections, they were very heavy, and they had a very strong also political class. All this was swept away, and the slate was entirely clean, and Berlusconi understood that there was a possibility for him.
And so then, maybe here we start to dig into the deeper thesis that you have. So you have a new book coming out in Italy in a month or something?
Yes.
And hopefully eventually translated into English. Specifically, the title is Counter-Revolution.
Yes.
Do you want to lay out that thesis a little bit about the current moment, and then we can kind of make some interconnections?
Okay.
And we can start to argue a little bit.
Well, no, my argument explained very plainly is that we are still living in the shadow of the 1960s. So we are still living in a revolutionary moment. We have been living through a revolution. What is the peculiarity of this revolution? And this is one of the reasons why we haven't fully recognized it as such, is that it is a non-political revolution. That is to say that in the 1960s, and with the outcome of the contestation and all that, between the 60s and the 70s, there was a kind of divorce between revolutionarism and politics. And the idea that you should change the world and make it a perfect place, instead of being channeled through politics, was channeled through morality, the judicial dimension, the law, and the economy. So somehow this is, kind of...
Maybe civil service, something like this, like kind of...
Well, that was one of the instruments. Technocracies and economic technocracy, civil service, judges, they were all instruments of this. Somehow, I'm picking on Samuel Moyne's thesis of that. According to him, human rights are the last utopia. I would say, my addition to that is one of the last utopias. The other utopias being the market and the transformation of morality. So using these instruments, we can change the world. So we have an impolitical revolution. Now, my further thesis is that, say, at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, with a Great Recession, this revolution appeared to be failed, and a counter-revolution set in. And what we call populism, as a matter of fact, is a rebellion against a revolution. So kind of counter-revolution.
So in effect, like, the argument is we actually have to understand. So this is because the story that you usually get, especially from people who want to defend the previous status quo, is something like so both in the 18th century and then after the World Wars, you get established a well-developed liberal regime. And that liberal regime is itself the kind of primary reality that we should rely on and trust. And then populism is itself just a defiance of democracy, of the popular sovereignty. It's a return to authoritarianism. But it seems like the story you're telling is actually like it's a much more intricate and I think much more subtle argument, which is that somehow try to talk through a little bit more. How does your argument about the first couple of decades after the World Wars work in contrast to that sort of, this was just the rise of, or the firm guarding and establishment of liberalism as like a proper political society?
Well, I'm using another expression by an American historian, John Gerard Raggi, about embedded liberalism. Now, of course, Raggi was writing about the economy and the relationship between state and market. I would say that after 1945, liberalism was embedded in many ways, not just in the relationship between politics and the economy. For instance, also, and I would even say that also democracy was embedded, meaning that if you think about the post-war constitutions in Europe, Italy, France, Germany, these were constitutions in which democracy was very strongly filtered through parliament, political parties. Political parties had also a very strong pedagogical element. So there was the idea that, of course, you have democracy, but you need to control it. And of course, the memory of Weimar, of the failure of the Weimar Republic, was very relevant there. And in many ways, even the European integration was meant as a way to limit democracy. Now, we have been discussing about the democratic deficit of the European Union, but this was after the 1970s. In the late 50s, there was also the idea, this is very clear in Italy. Italy had a very strong communist party. So those who were in favor of European integration thought, well, we need to tie ourselves to the other European countries. So if the communists take power in Italy, they will not be able to do whatever they want because Europe is going to block them. So a block to democracy. So my argument is that, if you will, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a liberal in the European sense of the word more than in the
American sense. How would you define the European sense?
Well, no, I mean, it's liberalism, of course, in the American parlance has taken more of a progressive, but liberalism essentially in Italy is a kind of, say, centrist or center-right idea in which you are very strongly in favor of individual freedom, but also with a very strong commitment to the market and to the free market. There is an economic element which is quite strong, and there is also some form of, I would say, pre-political sense of moderation, which I think in the United States has been somehow lost in the transformation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we often talk about on the podcast is the degree to which America doesn't, except for in very, very tiny factions, really have anything like a European conservative party of any kind, and never has, because everyone has to agree that the revolution was a good idea. So everyone in America is a post-revolutionary in that sense. And then trying to figure out the taxonomy of post-revolutionary thought is very specific. Whereas it seems like the kind of long-term view about tradition that European conservative parties often endorse in a strong way on the right is just absent on the American landscape. And so then that means that the notion of moderation in America is also very confusing. It's not really possible to kind of have that same picture of a kind of intermediate political settlement. I don't think. The way the institutions work is strange. I mean, this is also why libertarian thought has had such purchase in American conservative parties. It's in some way, both parties have to believe in freedom and then define that in different fashions. And so you have a certain kind of economic and eventually even social freedom, like you get in Ayn Rand on the right, and then something like libertarian social policies on the left in relation to all sorts of things around sexual politics and so on. Something like this is the landscape. And it does seem like that doesn't track the European situation hardly at all.
No, it is of course quite different, even though I'm not so sure that Europe too has not become a kind of post-revolutionary place, because of course modernity is so strong. And so who are the real conservatives today? What are you preserving today in Europe, since society has changed so much? I mean, look at for instance, I mean, conservatives in Italian history, of course, were very strongly connected with the Catholic Church and Catholicism. What is left of that, since the Catholic Church is not conservative any longer, and Italy is no longer, in reality, a strongly Catholic country. I mean, we are Catholic, nominally we are, but churchgoers, or think about France. Also in France, conservatism and Catholicism, but today in France, Catholicism is in very bad shape. So I'm not so sure that this is not applying to...
And even England is weird. I mean, Tories were often seen as initially semi-allied to some version of maintaining the monarchy, and then to a kind of landed aristocracy. But just this week, they decided to kick out the hereditary nobility out of the House of Lords. So you have a strike. I mean, it's a Labour government, but it's not creating mass revolts on the Tory side of the...
No, that's also the case. So one of the arguments my book is not a book on. I do not want to be in any way kind of an ideologue or ideological leader. It's a book of analysis. But in the epilogue, I try to say, well, look, you want to restore tradition, but there is no tradition that can be restored any longer. So essentially, if you want to restore a tradition that is dead, you end up being a revolutionary somehow, or, to have a rational plan that you want to restore. So there is a game there that makes things quite complicated.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the part of your work that I find especially novel and interesting is this dichotomy between politics and anti-politics. So maybe talk a little bit more. What is it about the 20th century, maybe early 21st century, that you see as having been largely anti-political? Like, lay out that case a little bit, and then we can talk about...
Well, my take, let's say my interpretation as an historian, is that, and this is what I've tried to map in the first two chapters of the book, is, well, we have the 20th century is the century in which we tried to reach a utopian condition through politics. It's communism, it's fascism. Of course, one can discuss to what extent these ideologies are entirely political, because things are very complicated, and, to establish what is the place of politics in Marxism is not so simple. But essentially, the idea was, collective action in the public sphere. And that's the way in which I create a perfect world. I bring about a utopian condition of perfection, or call it however you want. My argument is that in the 1960s, there is a kind of last explosion of this, which is those very strongly connected also to the idea that at the center of this perfect world, one must put the individual. So there was the idea that we should perfectly liberate individuals through politics. And here I find a major contradiction in terms, because if you want to act collectively, then you need to give up your individual freedom to a certain extent. And I've been not only saying this theoretically, but I've been looking at a number of political parties, political movements that were born out of 1968, and they all collapsed on this contradiction. Notably, there is a very interesting Italian case called Lotta Continua, continuous struggle, that founded exactly on this contradiction. So the idea is, come the 1970s, early, say 1972, 73, 74, you find yourself with this major contradiction. I want a revolution. I want to create a perfect world, but I want to create a perfect world in which individuals are free. But in order to do this, I need to mobilize them politically, reducing their freedom. So how do we cope with this? And this is where my idea is politics begins to wither away. You read it in the books of the in Eastern Europe.
I mean, this is almost Hobbes already. Like the question in Hobbes, I mean, this is like the contradiction about whether you can consider Hobbes a liberal, that he somehow is wanting to talk about the relationship between the individual and the state. But in order to be a member of the political community at all, you have to give up individuality and individual freedom to even, like, not even just have a political faction within a political experiment, but actually even to be a member of the polity at the beginning, you have to pull back from individuality.
Well, there is some form of you must give up something. And this is the reason why I believe that liberalism and utopia cannot stay together, because there is, you cannot bring to perfection individual liberty. You need to have individual liberty in the limits of human life. And part of those limits are the inevitable need for some form of community, some form of collective will, some form of state, some form of social order. So my argument is that somehow the idea to maximize all values at the same time brings to a collapse in the 1970s. And you see this in the works of the dissidents in Eastern Europe, notably Václav Havel, but not only Václav Havel, but also you see it in how in France 1968 is being reinterpreted mostly by the Nouveau Philosophe, reinterpreted as an anti-political revolution, despite the fact that 1968 in France was also highly political. So the idea is that politics is a problem. Politics is no longer the place when you build a better world, where you build a better world, is the place which prevents you from building a better world. And this is where I think this desire, this utopian desire for a better world becomes not only apolitical, but also positively anti-political. And this is, again, you see this in a lot of rhetorical utterances in Italy, in which you get secretary generals of parties saying, parties are bad. We shouldn't have parties. And the myth of civil society, which is very strong, end of 70s, 1980s, what is the myth of civil society? The idea that politics is a problem. And I think this is where this story begins. And other domains, the economy, the law, and morality begin to broaden their scope and somehow to invade the political space.
So, I mean, it seems like the American equivalent of this was the desire to move toward categories of analysis that are just broadly neutral. And so you get I think the strongest version of this would be someone like John Rawls, where he thinks there are these like large moral metaphysical frameworks that people live from, but we don't want that to disturb the key quote unquote political goods that we want to hold, such as equality or broad distribution of resources or the level of toleration and peace within the society. So what we want to do instead is develop an order that is well regulated to enhance those goods, toleration, peace, broad distribution of resources, and then minimize the level of those other conflicts into the private sphere, something, or like institutional sphere, something like this.
There are two authors that I've not considered, which are John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. And I've not considered them because I'm a political historian, not a political theorist. And I got the slight impression that in order to properly consider them, I would need let's say,
long time reading.
Exactly, long time reading, long time thinking. So I've moved on to easier authors that were also, I think, more into the directly connected also to political action, because they seem to me also easier to crack. But you are right. I mean, I think that's a major point.
No, I mean, I know both of those authors well, and it does seem to me like they are both captivated by something like an anti-political vision. That in both cases, in Habermas' case, it's something about more recently he's been trying to alter his thoughts for the age of populism, but his primary legacy is this idea that the possibility for rational deliberation resolves so many of the kinds of political tensions and sort of disabling features of political life that have threatened Europe in so many cases. So what we'll do is establish this kind of quiet, rational consensus, and then that will allow us to govern. And I think that mood has different features in Germany versus the United States, but it was definitely a very captivating view.
Well, what I know, the part of Habermas I know best is, of course, constitutional patriotism, because there's been a huge debate also in Italy. And again, this is clearly an attempt to refound a community on something that is abstractly chosen and not created by some form of tradition. So again, and I think there is a number of the authors, notably I covered some part of the British sociology that was also politically relevant, notably Anthony Giddens. But essentially, Giddens' idea is that we live in a post-traditional society in which every human being can choose their own values freely, rebuild their own identities freely, and then you can have a new post-traditional morality that can found a new post-traditional politics. And more or less, the idea of constitutional patriotism, as far as I can understand it, is more or less the same. The idea that you can, in abstract, sit down and draw a new set of values. And that is the point that I find fascinating. There is a book by Ulrich Beck that opens up with a fabulous quotation by Kandinsky, the painter, about the fact that the 20th century is the age of end, not the age of or. The 19th century was the age of or, of choices. The 20th century is the age of end, in which you can keep everything together. Bottom line, these ideas are connected to the idea that you can have at the same time individual freedom and community, that you can build your own community freely. So you can have the communitarian dimension, the social dimension, at the same time the individual dimension. And this is utopian. I think that there is a conflict there. Inevitably, you can, and above all, if you want to maximize both, you want to have a perfect community and a perfect individual freedom. You're bound to, the two things are bound to clash.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we talk a little bit about how you see the current backlash to all of this. What's shared with what happened with Berlusconi in the 90s with what you're seeing now on both sides of the Atlantic? What parts are not similar? And then how do you understand this kind of rejection of anti-politics?
Well, and again, we come to what is populism and whether we can say it's the same thing, because in many ways, Berlusconi was part of that story. Berlusconi was the man who was bringing to Italy this idea that we could have a liberal society, free markets, individual freedom, and that in very many ways Berlusconi was a man of end, and this kind of utopian idea that you can have it all, that there are no conflicts, and it was paradoxical because he was very strongly criticized for his utopian rhetoric. But as a matter of fact, when you read, for instance, Clinton, Blair, or even Kohl and Chirac, and then Berlusconi, he was the least utopian among them. The others were really, there are parts, the second inaugural by Bill Clinton is really full of utopian drive, but also are many speeches by Jacques Chirac in the late 90s. So,
and essentially the sense is that we've solved human life, that in some way all of these like inherent tragedies and difficulties that used to afflict previous ages. I mean, this is the kind of stereotype that's not quite fair to Fukuyama, but he does have this kind of hopeful strain where he thinks, okay, like there were lots of tragic dimensions that finally are like going to slip away from our politics and we just won't have to see them anymore.
Well, it is the end of tragedy, essentially, which has also been described. So it is the idea that we have put an end to the tragic character of human life because we can have it all. And all the speeches of the late 90s are totally full of this, completely. So again, we can have community, but also individual freedom. We can have economic growth and the protection of the environment. We can have a moral foreign policy, but also defend our interests. Clinton at certain moments says the US is going to be the greatest economic country of the world, but the others will not suffer from that. Which, you know, in a competitive setting, I mean, so it is. And again, there is, of course, this idea of technology that is going to solve all problems. So it's very strongly the 90s and in political rhetoric, this is extremely strong. And this, one can argue that Berlusconi is a populist, but more, I think, for his way of his political communication, his use of leadership, his use of his own personality. But when it comes to contents, Berlusconi is far more centered into this kind of... This is a major difference. I was asked sometimes about the difference between Berlusconi and Trump. Very great difference, because in Berlusconi's rhetoric, there are no walls. There is no need to protect oneself from the world. The world is a great place. Italians are great people. Just go and grab it. It's, you know, we need to get back to being the great inventive people, the exporters, and, you know, globalization is beautiful and we are going to gain a lot from it. In Trump's rhetoric, it is, of course, and again, it's the nation state is back, his protection is back, his deglobalization. This is
and that America can win that game specifically. I mean, I think that's kind of like we are going to be direct and honest about the competitive environment and the competitive nature of the world, and we can also win.
And that's one of the reasons why it is so difficult for Europeans to connect with that, because it is very different to say that from the US and to say that from Italy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's hard to have that appropriate. Yeah.
And so you say, well, look, we Italians are going to compete with China and win. Well, also, you know, quite.
Well, even the EU project was in a sense an attempt to do that, to make it so that Europe was a large enough actor to be able to compete at that game. But it also had so many negative features where it just, for one thing, you couldn't unify the continent that way, and for another, the idea of playing that game globally, it just doesn't make the same kind of sense that it does.
But again, when was the European Union born? Not European integration, the European Union, 1992, the Maastricht Treaty. So in what moment? Exactly in the moment of depoliticization. So essentially, and this is part of my argument, I only hint at this in the book, but my argument is Europe could gain greater integration in the 1980s and 90s exactly because in that moment the nation state was weak. And the nation state was weak because we were in a moment of depoliticization, which means that the European Union was born in a depoliticized state. Now we are back into politics, and the European Union quite simply cannot do it because it was born in a certain way, and now it cannot transform itself. And politics is still very strongly anchored in nation states. So, and this is the European tragedy, call it...
And in contestation. I mean, you could imagine a version of European institutions that maybe does allow bubbling up of like deep conflicts, both at the level of conviction or interest, and then that it does permit and have like effective mechanisms for those things to be thrown into conflict, and then the winners get to make decisions. But it doesn't work like that. The European Union's basic institutional infrastructure is just set up differently.
Exactly. I mean, politics has remained anchored in the nation state, and the European Union thinks itself is considered as a depoliticized entity exactly because it was born in that moment and for those reasons. And now, politics is stuck in the middle, and all decision making is stuck in the middle between nation states and Europe, and it is unable to move either forwards or backwards, and this is part of the European tragedy.
And that's probably even true even if you get populist parties surging into power. So maybe you could see the post-Brexit UK situation as being as allowing some kind of return of politics, because they're able to both have insurgent governments that are then able to make new decisions on the global stage. But on the other hand, their governments just keep falling over and over and over again, not quite sure how to leverage themselves in the middle of the situation.
And you still have anyway a problem of sides, and you still are, punching in a ring in which the others are far stronger than you are.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you see this? What do you think is likely to develop with this theme of insurgents against anti-politics over the next decade?
Well, my impression is that what we are having is a form of new dysfunctional politics. So essentially, we had a moment in which this kind of what I call this radical historical order, this kind of depoliticized and revolutionary order based essentially on the dream of pure unfettered individual freedom. I think that this kind of model tried to depoliticize, and at a certain moment populism was born or created or came up as an attempt at repoliticizing. And what we are getting now is a new political struggle between two blocks that are both depoliticized, because let's say the traditional order, again, was based on the idea of depoliticizing, but also populism has trouble in accepting political conflict. So we have a conflict between two partners, two contendants that do not really recognize fully politics, and in a condition which is today's condition in which it is very difficult to create strong and stable political alliances because of a very individualistic society, very fragmented society. So I think it is quite complicated to rebuild a meaningful political struggle.
And by politics here, we mean not just that you have a realm of contestation, but also that you have an effective mechanism for collective action. Is that effective?
I mean, absolutely. Otherwise, any kind of struggle between impotent actors would be pointless.
Yeah.
So, of course, you would need to have a politics that is really able to decide something.
Yeah.
And for instance, in Italy, we have very high level of abstentions and growing in the last 15, 20 years. And it is very clear that one of the reasons is that Italians don't believe that Italian politics matters any longer. Anyone they vote, more or less the decisions will be the same, because there are the limits of financial markets, European Union, and the law and international regulations, etc. So it is very clear that Italians don't think that Italian politics matters, but they also think that European politics doesn't matter, so they are frustrated.
Yeah. You don't have agency.
Exactly. They feel that they don't have agency.
I mean, and it's interesting because of course, populism in America is being driven by many different factors, some of them very convictional, some of them having to do with the substance of what people want from the country. I do also think at times maybe it's just being driven by people who want something to happen. Anything. It almost doesn't. The status quo is either frustrating or boring, and you just want it altered in some fashion. And so the fact that Trump, it is the case that like when he's especially erratic, like with the war, it's pretty unpopular. And I was listening, there were clips from Joe Rogan going around just his episode this week about the war. And he does talk about just how frustrated a lot of the people that supported Trump are with that specific occasion. So you can have it be too erratic in a certain way. But on the other hand, the idea that you want politics not just to be, and I think that there is a kind of swing against the kind of Obama style, we already know the right answers and we're just now going to implement them. That specific mode really drove people crazy, and that the feeling of wanting to have a version where they're not looked down on as stupid in that fashion seems really important.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think there is a lot of this. There is frustration. There is the sense that you don't have agency, that you cannot decide, that your life is governed elsewhere. But there is also the idea that things are boring and, that you want excitement. I mean, this is one of the, I think, the great reasons why all these ideas of, changing the world through morality of the 1990s essentially failed. I mean, they were based on a limited view of human
What kind of
nature.
morality do you see as, what were they trying to say about the nature of morality?
Oh, I mean, that was very clear that there is a sentence in a speech by Chirac, which is setting the scene very clearly. So essentially, they were thinking about persons who were they were ready to question all received wisdom. So they were rebels. Let's say they were respectful rebels, I would say. So the idea was that you would be yourself and impose your ideas and discuss whatever was given to you from authority. And this comes again from the Nouveau Philosophe, that kind of morality of the rebel, even Albert Camus originally. But at the same time, you're going to be extremely respectful of the rebellions of the others. So tolerant and, open to the others, and again, oriented towards the community. So you would be very strongly individualistic in your ideas, but at the same time ready to work with the others in a universalistic fashion. And this would be all over the world. This would be the kind of humans that we will have. And there are quite strong in these books of the 1990s. This is written quite strongly that this is what humans will become in the new post-traditional morality. I mean, this is an idea of human nature, which is,
I mean, okay, so I think maybe as we finish up, I guess the last question that I want to ask about is, I think another, or perhaps one of the strongest contrast cases between Italy and the Anglo-American world is you've had individualistic currents here, but they're happening against the backdrop of, I think, quite strong communal structures in all kinds of ways that end up happening at the local level, familial level, city level, all kinds of ways. Whereas it does seem like there's more of a backdrop of, like, the size of America is very big. The sense of individualism ends up happening very dramatically. People end up getting thrown into these large cities and mainly having to make it on their own in the market. Do you think that the difference between those two is right? And if it is right, does it give a different kind of set of possibilities on the Italian side than the Anglosphere side? Or how do you think that?
No, I think there is a difference there, and certainly Italy is a place of small towns, of small communities, is a place where the family is quite strong. In these last 20, 30 years also, this has grown much, much weaker. And still we have communities that are important, and not by chance. I mean, we have a major density divide in Italy too. I mean, politics is clearly divided. And if you look at, we say that the Italian left, the Partito Democratico, is the party of the Frecciarossa. The Frecciarossa is the high-speed train that is connecting Naples, Rome, Florence, Bologna, Milan, Turin. I mean, all these cities are all governed by the Partito Democratico.
We use exactly the same, the Acela corridor, which is Boston to DC.
Exactly. So it's, and that is very clear. Whereas if you look at where the right wing is voted, it is voted in small centers. So that is still an important element. And there is still, above all in some parts of Italy is also very, very diverse, but some parts of Italy, the quality of life in small communities can be high. Not in terms of how you earn. You don't earn that much, but the community works, the services are good, the place is nice, the climate is good. So it is quite clear, but this has been changing a lot in Italy also.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess then the question is there some sense of possibility on either side? I mean, either that of a certain individualist mentality will provide some future for politics that doesn't just devolve into like growing levels of acrimony, maybe violence, or that the background community structures will give a different sort of stability to this return of politics. I mean, because I think that it seems like we both agree that the age of anti-politics was bad and troubling in all kinds of ways. So then the question is, given the fact that it's now sort of hitting such intense critique, that critique can also go badly. I mean, it can also just lead to an age of violence or real acrimony spinning out of control. So the question is, are there any hopeful scenarios here where actually we get a different kind of political contestation coming back to the fore that is actually healthy?
Oh, that's of course a $1 million question, of course. And in many ways, I think we are living through a very similar phenomenon to what happened in the early 20th century, and it didn't end well at all.
I noticed that. Yeah.
At all. So it is again, and think about Norman Angell, The Great Illusion, the idea that war was over. I mean, all the optimistic thinking of the very early late 19th and very early 20th century. Clearly, we had a major political backlash then, a backlash of politics, and it didn't end well at all. And then after 1945, we had this kind of age of compromise in which we could have an individualistic world, but with very strong political elements, keeping everything together. Now we are in a similar condition, even though, again, if we compare the 2020s to the 1920s, we no longer have that kind of collective structure, the classes, the ideologies, not by chance. I mean, in the 1920s, we had fascism. Today, there is no proper fascism. There are people who play with fascism, but there is no strong ideological, let's say, construction, not to mention communism. So my idea is that, of course, we're living through a political rebellion. So politics is reestablishing its rights, and it is doing this mainly through the nation states, and that is very clearly happening in my now. My idea is that this can have a happy ending or a not too unhappy ending. Let's put it that way. If this becomes some form of counterbalancing element. So we find a new compromise, like after 1945, in which, yes, we still have an individualistic society, we still have individual freedom, but we have more of political control through some form of entity that I think cannot not be the nation state. Mm-hmm. Of course, the other option is that this spins out of control. So the problem is, can we get back to some form of compromise like after 1945 without passing through two major world wars? That is, since we hopefully have learned something from that, or we need to pass through that kind of crisis. That is, I think, the real question.
Well, this isn't exactly a hopeful note on which to end, but
No, it is not. But that's the drawback of studying history. There are lots of bad things happening in history, but sometimes also good things.
Yeah, also some beautiful.
So why not?
Yeah. People were still having good food and things in the middle of some of these crises. So this has been delightful. Thank you very much. And
thanks a lot, Sam.
And we'll keep checking in.